It was the summer of 1983, and the Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington had already earned its reputation as the most savage gathering in heavy metal history. 25,000 fans stood shoulder to shoulder in a muddy English field, their leather jackets steaming under a rare August sun, waiting for the kind of chaos that only this festival could deliver. But nobody in that crowd, not the promoters backstage counting their money, not the roadies tapping down cables, not even the bands tuning their instruments behind the massive Marshall stacks, could have predicted what was about to happen between two of the most dangerous personalities in rock and roll. Lemmy Kilmister, the bass-playing, whiskey-drinking, speed-fueled frontman of Motorhead, was about to say something to Eddie Van Halen that would ignite one of the most legendary confrontations ever witnessed on a festival stage. What started as a casual backstage encounter between two musicians who respected each other from a distance would spiral into a moment so electric, so raw, and so brutally honest that everyone who witnessed it would tell a slightly different version of the story for the next 40 years. And the reason nobody could agree on what actually happened that afternoon is because what Eddie Van Halen did in response was something that defied everything the rock world thought it knew about the quiet, shy guitar genius from Pasadena. Before we get into exactly what went down between these two titans, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we uncover on this channel are the ones the music industry never wanted you to hear. To understand why this confrontation sent shockwaves through the entire rock community, you first have to understand just how different these two men were. Lemmy Kilmister had been forged in the filthiest corners of the British underground music scene. By 1983, he had already survived being Jimi Hendrix's personal roadie in the late 1960s, getting arrested at the Canadian border in 1975 for amphetamines that customs officers mistook for cocaine, getting kicked out of Hawkwind, and building Motorhead from the ashes of that betrayal into the loudest, most unapologetic band on the planet. Lemmy drank Jack Daniels and Coca-Cola the way most people drink water. He consumed enough speed over the decades that doctors would later claim his blood chemistry had fundamentally altered to the point where giving him clean blood could actually kill him. He said exactly what he thought to whoever was standing in front of him, and if they did not like it, that was their problem, not his. Eddie Van Halen had arrived at the summit of rock and roll from an entirely different universe. Born in Amsterdam, raised in Pasadena, California, Eddie was classically trained on piano before he ever touched a guitar. By 1983, he had already changed the entire landscape of rock guitar with his revolutionary two-handed tapping technique, a sound so breathtaking that, when the first Van Halen album dropped in 1978, guitar players across the world literally stopped what they were doing and tried to figure out how one human being could produce those sounds. Where Lemmy was chaos, whiskey, and volume, Eddie was precision, innovation, and melody. Where Lemmy looked like he had crawled out of a bar fight in Soho, Eddie had the boyish grin and effortless California cool that made women scream and men want to be his friend. They were opposite poles of the same musical magnet, and on that summer day in 1983, those poles were about to collide. The backstage area at Donington in 1983 was not the sanitized corporate hospitality zone that festival goers might imagine today. It was a cramped, chaotic collection of trailers and makeshift dressing rooms where bands from completely different musical worlds were thrown together in uncomfortably close quarters. According to several crew members who were present that day, the trouble started hours before either band was scheduled to take the stage. Lemmy had been drinking since early morning, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was that he could hear Eddie Van Halen warming up on the other side of a thin canvas wall, running through scale exercises and tapping sequences that sounded like they belonged in a conservatory rather than at a heavy metal festival. Lemmy sat there listening for about 20 minutes, his Jack Daniels getting warmer in his hand, his expression growing darker with every perfectly executed arpeggio. The roadies around him knew that look. It was the look Lemmy got right before he said something that would either start a fight or end a friendship. What most people do not know about Lemmy is that beneath the image of the indestructible rock animal, there was a man with fiercely strong opinions about what music was supposed to be. Lemmy believed that rock and roll was supposed to be dangerous, simple, and devastating. It was supposed to hit you in the chest like a freight train, not tickle your brain like a math equation. He despised the overcomplication of heavy metal, the endless guitar solos that went nowhere, the technical showmanship that he believed had nothing to do with making someone feel something in their gut. And now, listening to arguably the greatest technical guitar player alive running through exercises that sounded more like a classical recital than rock and roll, something inside Lemmy snapped. He stood up, walked around the canvas divider, and stepped directly into Eddie Van Halen's space. But what he said, and what Eddie did in response, would not fully play out until both men were standing in front of 25,000 screaming fans. The exact words Lemmy used have been debated and retold so many times that the truth has become wrapped in layers of myth. But the core of what happened has been confirmed by enough people who were standing within earshot. Lemmy walked into Eddie's space, looked directly at the guitar player the entire world considered a genius, and told him flatly that all that tapping and all those fancy techniques were just circus tricks that had nothing to do with real rock and roll. He said Eddie played guitar like a man trying to impress other guitar players instead of grabbing an audience by the throat and making them feel something primal. It was not friendly banter. Lemmy meant every word, and the room went completely quiet because nobody talked to Eddie Van Halen that way. Eddie was beloved in the industry, not just for his talent but for his genuinely kind personality. He was the guy who would sit with a young, unknown guitarist for an hour and show him techniques. He praised other musicians in interviews instead of tearing them down. And now Lemmy was standing 3 feet in front of him, telling him that everything he had built his legacy on was meaningless flash. The silence lasted for what witnesses described as an impossibly long time. Eddie stood there holding his famous striped Frankenstein guitar that he had built with his own hands, looking at Lemmy with an expression no one could read. Some said he looked hurt, others said he looked amused. A few swore they saw anger flash in his eyes, but what everyone agrees on is what Eddie did next. He did not argue, he did not fire back, he did not storm out. Eddie Van Halen simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, and said something so quiet that only the people closest to him could hear it. What he told Lemmy in that whispered response would not make sense to anyone until both of them were on that festival stage hours later. The festival lineup that day had been carefully structured to build momentum, with each band set designed to be bigger and louder than the one before. Motorhead was scheduled earlier in the day, which meant Lemmy hit the stage while the sun was still high and the crowd was still sober enough to remember what they saw. Motorhead did what Motorhead always did. They came out like a bomb going off. The volume was physically painful. Lemmy stood center stage with his Rickenbacker bass angled up toward the sky in that iconic stance, his microphone positioned above his head, so he had to crane his neck upward to sing, giving him that signature growling posture unlike anything else in rock. They ripped through their set with relentless, punishing energy. The crowd responded with savage enthusiasm, a sea of raised fists and headbanging that turned the muddy Donington field into a war zone of noise. But somewhere in the middle of that set, something unexpected happened. Lemmy paused between songs, which was unusual because Motorhead was known for barely taking a breath between tracks. He stepped up to his microphone and started talking to the crowd about guitar playing. He talked about how rock and roll had lost its way, how too many guitarists were more interested in showing off than in making music that mattered. He never mentioned Eddie Van Halen by name, but everyone in that crowd who knew anything about the rock world understood exactly who he was talking about. The 25,000 people in that field went strangely quiet, sensing that something was happening that went beyond the normal between song banter. Lemmy was making a statement, drawing a line in the mud of Donington between what he considered real rock and roll and what he considered empty spectacle. And somewhere in the backstage area, Eddie Van Halen was watching on a monitor, hearing every word, and preparing a response that nobody could have anticipated. What Eddie had planned was not an argument, not an insult, and not a retreat. It was something far more devastating and far more brilliant than any of those options, and it would require him to do something on stage that he had never attempted before in his entire career. In the hours between Motorhead's set and Van Halen's scheduled performance, the backstage atmosphere shifted into something tense and electric. Word had spread quickly about Lemmy's comments, both the private confrontation and the public remarks from the stage. Music press journalists covering the festival could smell blood in the water and were circling backstage like sharks. But Eddie Van Halen had gone completely quiet. He had retreated into Van Halen's dressing area and told everyone, including his own bandmates, that he needed to be alone. His guitar tech later recalled that Eddie spent nearly 2 hours alone in that trailer, and the sounds coming from inside were not the usual blazing solos and tapping exercises. Instead, what filtered through the thin walls was slow, raw, and stripped down to the bone. It sounded absolutely nothing like Van Halen. What nobody understood was that Lemmy's words had not angered Eddie. They had unlocked something inside him that had been buried beneath years of technical perfection and audience expectations. Eddie had grown up idolizing the same raw blues players that had influenced the entire British rock movement. He worshipped Cream and early Clapton. He had spent his teenage years learning blues licks before he ever developed the tapping technique that made him famous. But the world had decided that Eddie Van Halen was a technical wizard, and Eddie, being the people pleaser he was at his core, had delivered exactly what the world wanted. He had become the greatest technical guitarist alive, but in doing so, he had buried the raw emotional player that lived underneath all those fireworks. Lemmy, with his blunt honesty, had accidentally struck the one nerve Eddie had been trying to ignore for years. When Van Halen took the stage later that evening, the 25,000 fans at Donington were primed for something special. The energy in the field had been building all day, fueled by the rumored backstage confrontation and Lemmy's pointed comments during his set. The crowd expected Van Halen to come out blazing, to answer Motorhead's raw power with their own brand of explosive, technically dazzling rock. The opening songs of the set delivered exactly that. Eddie played with ferocious precision, his fingers moving across the fretboard with the kind of speed and accuracy that had made him a living legend. David Lee Roth commanded the front of the stage with his acrobatic showmanship, and the Van Halen rhythm section locked into a groove that shook the ground beneath the audience's feet. Everything was going according to script, and then it changed. About 40 minutes into the set, Eddie signaled to the rest of the band, and the music stopped. The sudden silence after that wall of sound was almost shocking. David Lee Roth looked confused for a moment, then stepped back from the microphone. The crowd murmured, uncertain about what was happening. Eddie stood alone at the front of the stage, and for the first time that anyone could remember at a major festival, he spoke directly to the audience in something more than a brief introduction to the next song. He did not mention Lemmy by name. He did not reference the backstage confrontation or the comments during Motorhead's set. Instead, he told the crowd that he wanted to play something different, something he had not played for an audience in a very long time. Then he began to play, and what came out of his guitar in the next 7 minutes was something that silenced 25,000 people in a way that no amount of volume ever could. It was not tapping. It was not shredding. It was not any of the technical pyrotechnics that the world associated with Eddie Van Halen. It was blues, pure, raw, stripped-down, gut-wrenching blues. The kind of playing that does not impress your brain but reaches directly into your chest and squeezes your heart until you cannot breathe. Eddie played with his eyes closed, his body barely moving. His fingers drawing sounds from that guitar that most people in the audience had never heard from him before. Each note hung in the evening air like smoke, heavy with emotion, and completely devoid of anything that could be called a trick or a gimmick. It was the sound of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down in front of 25,000 witnesses. Somewhere around the fourth minute of that solo, something remarkable happened in the crowd. People stopped cheering. They stopped raising their fists. They stopped doing all the things that festival crowds are supposed to do. They just listened. 25,000 people standing in a muddy field in the English Midlands, many of them drunk, most of them there for the loudest and most aggressive music on earth, went completely still and quiet while Eddie Van Halen played the blues like his life depended on it. Roadies who had been working festivals for decades later said they had never seen anything like it. The silence of that crowd was louder than any amplifier, more powerful than any pyrotechnic explosion, more meaningful than any standing ovation. It was the sound of recognition, of 25,000 people simultaneously understanding that they were witnessing something that went beyond entertainment and into the territory of genuine human truth. And backstage, standing in the shadows beside a monitor with a Jack Daniels in one hand and a cigarette in the other, Lemmy Kilmister watched every second of it. When Eddie finally let the last note fade into silence, the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the portable structures backstage. It was not the usual cheering that follows a great solo. It was something deeper, more guttural, almost primal. They were not applauding a performance. They were acknowledging a confession. And then Eddie did something that would cement this moment in rock and roll legend forever. With the crowd still roaring, he turned slightly toward the side of the stage where he knew the backstage monitors were, and he gave a small nod. Not a bow, not a wave, not any kind of grand gesture, just a nod. The same kind of nod he had given Lemmy in that dressing room hours earlier. And this time, everyone understood what it meant. It meant thank you. Thank you for seeing through the fireworks and demanding something real. Thank you for being the one person in this entire industry honest enough to say what needed to be said. Thank you for reminding me who I was before the world told me who I should be. What happened between Lemmy and Eddie after that festival did not follow the script the rock press desperately wanted to write. There was no ongoing feud, no series of public insults traded through interviews, no dramatic reconciliation captured on camera. Instead, what developed was something far more rare in rock and roll. It was genuine, quiet mutual respect that expressed itself not in grand public gestures, but in small private moments that only a handful of people ever witnessed. Crew members who worked both Motorhead and Van Halen tour reported that whenever the two bands crossed paths, Lemmy and Eddie would find each other backstage and talk. Not about music or the Donington confrontation, but about life, motorcycles, World War II history, and the strange loneliness that comes with being famous in a world that only sees the character and never the person underneath. Lemmy continued to dismiss technical guitar playing in interviews and insist that rock and roll should be simple and devastating. But those who knew him noticed he never again directed those criticisms specifically at Eddie. On the rare occasions Eddie's name came up, Lemmy would get a look on his face that was almost tender, a word nobody had ever associated with the frontman of Motorhead. For his part, Eddie began incorporating more raw, bluesy passages into his live performances after that summer. It was subtle at first, just a few bars during extended solos, but over the years it became more prominent. Music critics noticed the shift but could never pinpoint what caused it. They wrote analyses about Eddie's evolving artistic vision, without ever tracing it back to a blunt-spoken Englishman who had the audacity to tell the greatest guitarist alive that his playing did not mean anything. The years that followed carried both men through triumphs and tragedies that would have destroyed lesser human beings. Lemmy continued to tour relentlessly with Motorhead, playing over 300 shows a year while consuming enough Jack Daniels and amphetamines to poison a small village. His health began to deteriorate in the 2000s, with diabetes forcing him to swap his beloved whiskey for vodka and orange juice, a change that wounded his pride more than any critic ever could. He was hospitalized multiple times and forced to cancel shows, watching his own body betray him after decades of treating it like an indestructible machine. But he never stopped playing, never stopped being the most brutally honest voice in a music industry that increasingly valued image over substance. Eddie Van Halen fought his own demons. His struggles with alcohol led to a painful public divorce from Valerie Bertinelli. He battled cancer, first in his tongue and then in his throat and lungs, enduring treatments that ravaged his body while he continued to play guitar with supernatural ability. Through it all, Eddie carried the lesson from Donington, that the most powerful thing a musician can do is not impress an audience but move them, reaching past technique and spectacle to touch something that lives in the space between the notes. Lemmy Kilmister died on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, following a diagnosis of aggressive prostate cancer and congestive heart failure. The world mourned him as the last true outlaw of rock and roll. Eddie Van Halen followed less than 5 years later, passing on October 6, 2020, after a long battle with cancer. The rock world lost two of its most irreplaceable voices within half a decade, and with them went an era when musicians were allowed to be raw, flawed, dangerous, and genuinely honest with each other. Looking back on that summer afternoon at Donington, it is easy to reduce what happened to a simple story about one musician insulting another and getting an unexpected response. But that misses the deeper truth that made this moment resonate through decades. What happened between those two men was not a confrontation. It was a conversation, conducted in the only language both of them truly trusted, about what music is actually for and what it costs the people who make it. Lemmy was asking a question Eddie had been avoiding for years. Are you playing for them or for yourself? And if you do not know the answer, what is the point? And Eddie answered in front of 25,000 witnesses with 7 minutes of playing that came from somewhere deeper than technique, deeper than training, deeper than anything that can be learned. He played from the place where music first lives before it becomes a career or a legacy. He played from the place where a kid in Pasadena first picked up a guitar and felt the world make sense for the very first time. That is what Lemmy heard in those 7 minutes. That is why he nodded from the shadows backstage. And that is why, for the rest of his life, the loudest man in rock and roll never said another word against the quietest genius who ever picked up a guitar.